Hi, welcome to Seven Strategies, Coping with the Recent Death of a Loved One. I'm Libby Harrington. I'm a grief counselor with Providence Hospice.
And I am Jamie. I am also a grief counselor with Providence Hospice. And welcome. We typically do Seven Strategies live, and we thought it would be helpful to do a recording so that people who maybe can't attend our live classes can participate. And so we'll be doing this fairly organically, kind of passing back and forth, and also want to invite you. It's okay. This is a class, so it's okay if you decide that you want to attend another one, an in-person one. We have several of us who do it, and during the live version, there is a little bit of interaction. So some people sharing the person they lost, a little bit of their experience. So it's a little bit different experience if you're interested in participating. And just like we would if we were doing this live, I want to encourage you during this time to take good care of yourself. That might mean just pausing the recording if this is feeling overwhelming or you just need to kind of take a bit of a break. We do find that it can feel helpful because there's some normalization and validation of your experience, but for some people also overwhelming. So yeah, take good care. And I know for me personally, I often reference my notes and we'll just kind of pause as I'm making sure that I've covered everything. So glad you're able to be with us. Okay. All right, so I'm going to start with the goals of this workshop. First, I always like to add that, this word strategy can kind of have this connotation that there are maybe these things to do that will then eliminate the really intensity, the intense emotions of grief. But actually, these are kind of offerings or things to consider that might help you feel supported as you go through this very turbulent, up and down, very raw experience. So we do have some goals, though, that we're hoping to offer you as we go through this recording. So we are going to spend just a little bit of time talking about grief in general, a description of that, and you might recognize some of what you're experiencing in that. Some of it you won't, and that's okay. We do want to offer and explore some ideas for coping with grief, specifically early grief. You might hear us reference acute grief, early grief. Those might feel different, and they're different lengths of time for everyone. But do want to offer some ways to have you consider what might feel most helpful for you to cope with this. And then we will also spend some time kind of offering some information about accessing support and helping others help you. So a lot of what we hear as well is that sometimes people don't know how to support you, what would be most helpful, and everyone's needs are different. And so we'll give some support to you, and you might actually be watching this because you want to support someone who is grieving, and or you hear this and some of this feels helpful, feel free to pass it on to people in your life as well to get some information. Yeah, okay. So we'll go on to the next. So we have lots of quotes in this presentation, and some of them might resonate more than others. So just kind of let it, take what is helpful in this entire presentation and let go of what's not. Like it's for you. So this is a C.S. Lewis quote. I thought I could describe a state, make a map of sorrow. Sorrow, however, turns out to be not a state, but a process. It needs not a map, but a history. So we do sometimes kind of hear a version of like, how do I do this? Where's the map for this? Where's the the book, the manual for this. And it turns out that, of course, there's not a manual for this, and there's not a roadmap, that each individual journey will be very, very different, just as the relationship with your loved one was very unique. All right. So, and I'm going to be also at times referencing the packet of handouts that you were emailed. So if you have those, you don't have to reference them right now. We'll just kind of point you in the direction where you might find some things. So this is, again, just a little bit of information about grief. Certainly, grief is a very normal, healthy reaction to loss. I like to say it's a congruent reaction to loss. Your response to the loss of your loved one is going to be very unique and personal. And so you may be someone that has had a significant loss before, and the loss that you're experiencing now may look similar and may be very, very, very different. But it is normal, and it is a healthy response. It's a response to being close and attached to someone. So it's definitely a process. I know sometimes that word is not all that helpful because it's not rooted in anything that you can really grab onto, but it certainly is not kind of a one-time event, and then you spend all this time kind of going from that one point. It is a process. It's not linear. It ebbs and flows. We certainly, still here, it's very deeply embedded into our culture, the 5 stages of grief, and we very much know that there are not stages to grief. That it's very cyclical. It's a process. You revisit things, and it's not a one-time event. Again, it's not linear. It certainly consists of ups and downs. You might hear analogies to roller coasters or waves. And it can also be why it's so challenging to feel like you're getting a grasp on some of it, because just as you feel like, okay, I'm learning what might feel helpful with coping with this, boom, it changes. It's kind of this like different part of your journey. I often will hear things like, I had a setback, I regressed. And it's just an encouragement to think about, like, it's not linear. So this idea that sometimes that can be language that might reflect it being linear, like you start here and you kind of move along this path, but really it's just quite all over the place and up and down. And that is very normal and expected. It can be very unpredictable or confusing. You might be experiencing many emotions all at once, and some that seem to be in conflict that don't necessarily make sense. You might find that all of a sudden the very smallest thing is creating a very large grief response. So I'll hear things like, I was in the grocery store and I saw their favorite food, and all this, this surge of emotion came up, or a simple personal item that you run across, a photo. It's very unpredictable, very confusing. It's quite unmooring in that way. And then lastly on this page, it is unique to each person and to each loss, as I mentioned before, that it's every new loss is new territory. You might also then revisit old losses, but just as your relationship to the person was very unique and that you were unique individuals, it'll be different for each person and each loss. Anything I missed that you want to add to that, Libby?
No. I think that's all I would say too.
Okay.
We're going to go to another quote from C.S. Lewis. He wrote a lot about grief in a book called A Grief Observed after the death of his wife. And here he says, "For in grief, nothing stays put. One keeps on emerging from a phase, but it always recurs. Round and round, everything repeats. Am I going in circles, or dare I hope I'm on a spiral? But if a spiral, am I going up or down it? How often? Will it be for always? How often will the vast emptiness astonish me like a complete novelty and make me say, I never realized my loss till this moment. The same leg is cut off time after time." I come back to this quote. And my thinking about grief, I think it captures some of that early confusion that Jamie was talking about, that unpredictability, and just repeating, thinking you might be done with something, and then finding yourself back in those feelings again. Grief can manifest in many ways. There may be a handout that you received that is called Manifestations of Grief. Um, I think of it as kind of impacting every part of you, every circle of your life. How we feel physically, it can be actually really surprising for a lot of people. It can feel like pain in your chest. It can feel like upset stomach. It can feel like pain all over your body, fatigue, any number of things, and surprising things sometimes. How we feel emotionally might seem obvious, but even that can be surprising. Just it's not just sadness, big sadness. It's all kinds of emotions. How we think, this can be frustrating. You may have trouble focusing and concentrating. You may forget things, whole conversations or appointments, and that may never have been you before. um, how we relate to others is impacted. You may find, just for an example, like you want to isolate, or you're having trouble relating to people while also feeling lonely. All of these things may happen, but changes to how you relate to others is a normal part of grief, as well as how we behave. Um, I think about sleep behavior, eating behavior, again, social behavior, just all kinds of things may feel different and unfamiliar and confusing. It also impacts our understanding of the world and how we make sense of things. Grief tends to bring out a lot of questioning for a lot of people.
Thanks, Libby. Okay. So we're going to move into kind of what the phase of the 7 strategies, or the seven things to consider as you move through your grief journey. So the first one is to reflect on how your loss is unique. This quote, "A human being is a single being, unique and unrepeatable." I'm sorry, because in my mind I'm thinking irreplaceable. That is part of the extreme despair that can happen, because this is truly a person who cannot be replaced. And because of that, that person is unique, you are unique, and your relationship is unique. So just to give some thought to how on how your loss is unique, we like to. I'm going to go to the next page. You might hear us talk about these kind of determinants of grief, and essentially that the reasons why your grief might be showing up the way that it is. I like to think about it in some ways like this big pot of stew, right? And you're going to put in different ingredients, and every example that is going to have a different flavor because of what's put in. So this idea of who the person was to you, how close of an attachment figure was this person? Was this person someone you spent every single day with? Is this a person that you knew from a long time ago? Is this, the nature of the relationship, the person, who the person was to you? Also involved, I really want to validate for those of you who might be listening who was a very important person in your life, and maybe a very challenging and complicated relationship, that those relationships, that dynamic can absolutely kind of show up in this determinant of grief. And to not minimize, we don't want to minimize that there is often a lot of love and a lot of ambivalence or complications in many relationships. So the age of the person can certainly impact how you're experiencing your grief. As I mentioned, the nature of the attachments, this can work into if it was a conflicted relationship, if this was an attachment figure, you may have lost a parent, and every single day of your life, you've had this person in your life in one way or the other. So adjusting to that can be quite challenging, in addition to just strong attachments in general. How the person died is going to, impact how you experience your grief. So one thing I notice is, we work with a lot of people in hospice who had a prolonged illness, but also people from the community come and access our support services who may have experienced a sudden death. But also, interestingly, even with people who had a prolonged illness and the death was expected, there's a huge level of shock involved for many people. Maybe it happened much quicker than they thought. Maybe there was a lot of pain involved in someone's death. That might feel different, in relation to your experience of if a person died peacefully, from your impression, and you got to say goodbye. Those kinds of things can impact your grief. So family heritage, meaning, what were your family norms around grief? What were you taught? What was okay? How to express grief? That it was okay to grieve? Was this something that it was okay to talk about when someone died? Maybe not. And so all of these things are going to feed into the loss that you're experiencing now. And some of you may not even know what those family kind of norms were or are until you maybe bump into your experience and kind of how it's showing up. But certainly our family of origin can impact how we internalize that what's okay, what's not okay, and whatnot. So yeah, previous losses and how they were grieved. So I will often hear from people that a new loss will resurface a previous loss, and that is very, very normal. I also hear that people feel like they didn't get a chance to grieve someone before, and that might then also show up. So I hear, it runs the gamut of why that might be true. So for instance, some people, there was like a death, and then they had to all of a sudden pivot to care for another person, or something else in their life came up, their own illness, or maybe a job, or things like that, or maybe just their own coping style that they weren't feeling like as if they got to properly grieve in a way that felt supportive. So those previous losses will show up. So your individual personality will be part of this, how you engage the world and your experiences, your own emotional landscape. Some people are, people who very much focus on tasks. We'll get into grieving styles soon. Some people are very comfortable with their own emotions. For some people who are thrown into grief, that those very, very intense emotions might feel very new, and really challenging to engage, which is completely understandable. But your personality and how you manage things and how you go about coping will come into play as well. And this beliefs, we can use a very kind of broad stroke around what that might mean, but it can also relate again to like that what are your internalized beliefs around what's okay in grieving and what's not okay. So I hear a lot of people say, I thought I was really strong, and then all of a sudden this huge loss happened, and I'm not coping very well, or X, Y, and Z. And I often will pause and just really pause around like that. What does it mean to be strong, right? Like we might have a very strong belief that like it's to be stoic and to not, feel vulnerable, and really, it can look like a lot of different things, including being, having those intense emotions as well. So. Yeah, society's views of death. I feel like I'm somewhat hopeful that we've made some progress, and yet there are still some very pervasive messages, and you might be bumping into those, kind of like how should someone be grieving in the very beginning, so I get calls from people whose family, their family members are concerned because they're not crying a lot or they're not talking about it, and somehow there's some like this is what it should look like. Conversely, if people are kind of into their grieving process, these are just generalizations that are always true, but and they're crying a lot or they seem distraught for a longer period of time than our society allows, it kind of switches, and then people get concerned. And so you might be finding yourself on these very not helpful, harmful kind of timelines, messages, our views of death, what we talk about, what we don't talk about, and therefore your experience of your grief might involve some conflict with those. And certainly don't want to minimize that there might be additional stressors in your life. So, you might be now parenting alone. You might be caring for another parent. You might be, having to move. You might have your own health challenges, family stressors. All of those things really contribute to how your grief will show up. So this is definitely not an exhaustive list, but just some things to think about for yourself.
Yeah, thanks. I love how you talked about a stew. And I think with all those different ingredients or amounts of ingredients going in, I think there's a kind of an underlying invitation to notice our natural tendency to compare, and maybe notice that it's not that helpful to compare losses, compare yourself to someone else's grieving. We're going to talk a little bit here about identifying your grieving style and maybe understanding a little bit about others' grieving styles when you see them. If my emotion is less than yours or more, given the same circumstances, try not to ask me to feel more strongly or weakly. Or yet if I act or fail to act in the manner of your design for action, let me be. It's a little bit about that comparing again. So we have here a spectrum of some styles of grief. This is one way to conceptualize grief. There are a lot of models and ways to think about your inner world or grief. Like Jamie said, we're offering these. If something works for you, take it. If it doesn't, just leave it where it is. There is a handout that goes with this too that has a little bit more about this model of grief. So again, stressing that it is a spectrum, so it's not black and white. You're probably not going to find yourself completely to one side or the other of this spectrum, but somewhere in the middle, somewhere in blended. And you may feel like you move on it over the course of your life, over the course of this grief. And in general, the more intuitive griever might be having needs like to talk about what they're feeling. They may express it through crying. They may feel sapped of energy and like they need to be still. And this is real broad strokes, but instrumental grievers may be more likely to be active, have a project, making things, doing things. They may actually feel some restlessness. And like I said, you may recognize some of both in yourself. I identify myself as, needing to talk, needing to cry, and I found some projects extremely helpful in my grief, making a slideshow and things like that. I think it's important also to note that this is not gendered, although it may be tempting to think that it is. And in fact, those stereotypes about gender and how we grieve can be harmful. And For example, if I identify as a woman and I notice that I'm not crying, I'm not needing to talk about it, I may think, what's wrong with me? If I identify as a man and I am crying and wanting to talk about it and connect with people, then I may wonder, am I doing something wrong? Or feeling that judgment from others. It truly is not a gendered thing.
Okay. So number 3 is to access support. The shoe that fits one person, it pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. This is Carl Jung. So certainly in working with so many people who are grieving, I have noticed that having support does make a pretty big difference. The thing about this strategy or invitation is that you get to decide what support looks like, what support feels helpful. So, for instance, your loved ones might be saying like, join a group, and groups might not be your thing. You might experiment and see how it goes, but it's really important that you get to decide what that looks like. And it just really, there's so many forms of support. So we're gonna just explore a few of those options and maybe ways to think about it. And the other thing I want to stress too is that it doesn't have to look, so sometimes I've changed the question that I've asked of like, who is in your support system, whatever, is to, do you feel supported? Because someone can name 20 people that are there and feel just as supported as somebody who has 2 or 3, or one really important person, or a few different forms of support. It doesn't just come through by way of people. So let's see. It can take many forms. This is an invitation just to spend some time thinking about friends, family, professionals. Animals are huge when it comes to support for a couple of reasons, to be just that kind of unconditional loveliness they can provide. And also sometimes people are like, they're what get me out of bed in the morning. I have to kind of care for them. But you might have, different forms of support. I do want to acknowledge that, some people we work with for lots of reasons. Sometimes when there's a prolonged illness in place or happening, sometimes support has kind of lessened over time because the focus has increased and the needs have increased. And so you might be finding yourself in your grieving process feeling like, wow, I don't have a lot of support. This is, again, why we have other kind of professional supports in place as well. They don't just have to come from friends and family. There's lots of different but this is an invitation to think about what they can provide. So support, again, can look like a lot of different things. There is a handout for you, like a support inventory. And to think about, kind of to name people in this example who can provide support. This can be your doctor, your neighbor, your friend, someone in your your faith community. And these individuals might be able to provide all of these. So for instance, practical help. Is there someone who can, help make some meals, maybe do something around the house for you, do an errand for you? Some people might be very, very good at providing that emotional support, listening, especially when we talked about the grieving styles, kind of knowing like, oh, this is a need of mine to have someone to listen to me. And some people might be really helpful to provide respite. And that could look like, you're not necessarily talking about your grief or your loss, but you're able just to kind of get out and take a break, maybe go for a walk, maybe grab a meal, maybe go for a movie, and just to kind of take a break. We call it dosing grief, that you can't be in that acute grief all the time. So you might find that some people in your support group can really do the practical stuff and not so great at the listening. But again, that's a really important piece of what you might need, is to get that very practical support. You might find people who really great at listening, but just even for whatever reason aren't available to do the practical pieces. So it can be helpful to either list, whether like actually list on this support inventory, or even in your mind of like who can provide these things. You might get really lucky and have some people in your life who can do all of these things for you, who can provide all of these needs. But it can be helpful to think to really kind of expand what support can look like. I mean, there are support groups. There are a lot of online supports these days. I mean, the ways that that technology can serve you can also be very helpful. We put this in here of like, yeah, consider asking yourself what gets in the way of asking for what you need and want. Because to add on to that for many people, grieving is incredibly vulnerable. You might find yourself in completely new territory. And then on top of that, you might be finding that you are having a lot of needs and wants. I want someone to do this. I need someone. And I would really encourage that, like, need and want, like wants are really important too. Sometimes we elevate need over want, but it's okay to express what you want. But sometimes what we might find if we reflect is like, wow, there actually is a lot of support out there. And I'm finding that I'm struggling to ask for help or to access it. And so it's just an invitation to consider, how comfortable that is for you. I think sometimes, you might find that you're typically in a role where you're the one supporting people, and so now you might be in a position where you need a lot of support, and it's like a new muscle you're working to ask for help, support, and then to also utilize it. So again, and the last piece here is on this slide is to consider that creating a support inventory. I did have someone at one point in one of my that I worked with that actually did this, and then put it in their wallet or bag, and that even just having that felt supportive, because they could pull it out and kind of look, and even if they didn't reach out, there's this like, I have people in my corner. Just to make sure I'm not. Anything you would add to that, Libby?
No, I think you're right. Sometimes I've seen that support inventory help people understand that they might have more than they thought. Sometimes we're only counting the listeners, and I think also helping to reduce frustration of yourself and maybe even your support people, in not expecting them to be something that they simply aren't.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, and this can be a tool as well, because, we talked about these grieving styles. And so if you have a sense of like, oh, this is my grieving style right now in my grief process, then you can also identify potentially what some of your needs are. So if you're a person with, you're more of a intuitive griever right now, and so you need to talk about it, but then you're doing this inventory and saying, wow, I have a lot of people who can do things for me, but not a lot of listeners, then it could be a tool to then say, okay, how can I get some listeners in my life? Maybe that's through a counselor or support group, those kinds of things. So there's some purpose to support too. Some people find it really helpful just to have I shouldn't say just, but to have their grief witnessed. So, I hear the word productive sometimes. It's not productive. Nothing happens if I just by talking about it. But actually, for some people, not for everyone, but for some people, having someone present to process, kind of download feelings, can be very powerful. To have their to tell your story, to give voice to it, can be very, very powerful. So those people who can offer respite, you really might need some breaks from your grief. Some distractions, a way to kind of take a breather. For some people who are intuitive grievers, it might be very hard to find breaks. You might feel really quite emotionally flooded, and that's kind of a generalization about that grieving style, but often it does come with having a bit of it can be harder to find those breaks, but again, they can be very useful and are okay. So we definitely hear a lot of times that when there's a break, or let's just say there's a moment of pleasure or a moment of laughing, and then boom, quickly after that, it can be followed by guilt or by feeling bad, like how can I be laughing or having a good time when this person is no longer here. But it is very normal and oftentimes very important to get those breaks. And then also you might just need help with tasks that are extremely overwhelming or new to you. So a lot of what we know about the grieving process too is that in addition to this very painful loss of a person, you are also potentially experiencing a lot of change and having to learn new things, do new things, and that can be taking a lot of energy that you might not probably don't have. So again, just want to really acknowledge that how overwhelming that can be. Sorry, I'm still next. So I won't go through this entirely, but you do have a handout called Companioning, and this is kind of the model of support that we use. It's really beautiful in my mind just because it does come from a perspective of really honoring. There's dignity in the way that you are grieving and the way that you're doing this, and it honors that process and the dignity of it, and that it doesn't come. We're not coming to you. The model isn't coming to you as like there's an expert way of doing this and we're here to tell you how to do it. It really is honoring what is true for you and walking kind of companioning alongside you. And so that the entire companioning piece is in your handout. And you might just, kind of note or put a star next to whichever ones feel really comforting or helpful. I know when I read this, I'm comforted by it and I feel like it's empowering to people that there isn't a right or wrong way to do this. And so you get to decide, but to surely to have some people alongside with you, not leading or following, can be really helpful.
And this fourth strategy here that we've arrived at, nurture yourself. This is, again, we keep using this word, but this is, again, an invitation that, consider the idea that all you need to do today is take really good care of yourself physically. Being compassionate and gentle with yourself and getting back to basics in early grief can be really helpful. And that's thinking about sleeping, eating, drinking water, taking a few breaths of fresh air, physical movement. And along with this, for me, goes kind of checking in with expectations and beliefs maybe about productivity. And what that means. And, even the physical movement piece, you may not be doing, if you had a big exercise routine in your life before, maybe that's changed and maybe you can check that box today if you walk around the block. But this is just basic care. Thoughts have power. Thoughts are energy, and you can make your world or break it by your own thinking. That is a quote to take us into this next strategy, which is becoming aware of your thoughts. noticing and examining your self-talk, your inner dialogue, your inner monologue, whatever that is, it can be really helpful. Just noticing, even without trying to stop or change anything, is a really big step. Notice if you have shoulds and oughts in your self-talk. That could be about the grief, about your behavior, about other people, just becoming aware of that word should. And the black and white thinking kind of goes back to the one before about, did I move my body or not, being different than did I complete this entire 45-minute exercise routine. Black and white thinking, I think, could be real harmful actually in grief. This might be waiting to feel all the way better, whatever that means, instead of noticing the way that your grief shifts and changes. People that can notice those little shifts, I think, do better. Self-criticism. Notice this. We all have probably a critic inside of us. Noticing how harsh or what they are saying can be a step. And noticing primary and secondary emotions. This is part of your inner world. This is referring to, let's say the primary emotion is I feel angry, and then I might have another emotion that is like guilt about feeling anger, shame about feeling anger. I might feel guilt about feeling happy. Any number of things. That's what that secondary and primary is referring to. Jamie, did you want to say anything about the second arrow?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about the primary and secondary emotions in the second arrow is that I'll speak for myself, but when I became aware of this, like all of a sudden I was like, wow, this happens a lot. Like it's essentially any judgment that you might have about your actual experience, right? So it's kind of the label, it's not okay to feel this way, or that it's, and then we kind of talk about it as like the primary emotion, the first arrow kind of like hitting is hard enough, and then the second arrow can really add a lot of suffering if there's a sense of like it's not okay for me to be feeling this way. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in a way we can think of that second suffering, that second arrow, as a little bit optional, whereas the first one isn't. The feelings are the suffering is inevitable in life, and then the judgment about it is maybe not so inevitable.
That is true. I think like that. I like that. Okay. So this next one is find ways to honor your loved one. What we have once enjoyed and deeply loved, we can never lose. For all that we love deeply becomes a part of us. Helen Keller. This feels like a big one because there are so many ways to honor your loved one, and it's one of the gifts of this work that I feel like is a gift of this work, is to really hear how people choose to honor their loved one. But what we also find, or I find, is that it's also a place where people can find a lot of comfort and a lot of connection with the person that was lost, the person who died. So Libby just mentioned that kind of that primary emotion. We don't often have a say in how grief shows up, right? It's happening to us, but we do have a say in kind of how we mourn or how we express that grief. And so honoring can be a way to mourn in that way. So Rituals are a great example of a way to honor. Rituals can also provide kind of you might have some individual personal rituals that you choose to do, and you might have some collective, whether it's with a group of friends or family or a community of some kind. And these can be formal or informal. I know some people who they're missing the person who died, and they'll light a candle, and that's kind of a ritual. Or even the ritual of a morning routine can be really helpful for some people, and it's not necessarily directly connected to a ritual around grief, but the ritual helps to kind of bring some kind of grounding to the person who's grieving. It can be helpful to participate in rituals because they can create a space, and they offer permission to mourn. I do find, you might be experiencing this sense of like leaning into grief, or that is a ritual is kind of a way to like lean into it, to kind of step into maybe more active grieving, and that might feel very, very overwhelming right now, and so it's okay to not do that. And I do also hear a lot of people say, I really want to do that. I really want to carve out times to kind of maybe actively grieve. And when I say actively grieve, I mean maybe intentionally grieve, or to intentionally mourn, because you're grieving all the time. But it can give you permission, like, this is okay, I get to fill up this space, I get to express right now. So these are just a couple of just very few examples. So an obvious one might be a memorial service, and we really saw the impact of not being able to gather for services during COVID. We're still in many ways, but that period when you just actually couldn't gather. And the impact of that, that for those who wanted to, there was definitely people who found it helpful to not have the pressure to do that as well. So it can be different for different people, but for those who wanted to, it was very challenging. Another example is lighting a candle. People plant a tree. Like I mentioned, daily practices, making the favorite food of the person who died. Lots of different things. This really can be this can be a form of expression. It is a form of expression. It can be a creative way to connect. Some people find this, these rituals, again, very comforting. You kind of can use your energy to plan something. Are you thinking of, and just when I ask for some help, if you're thinking for anything else that you kind of notice for rituals, Libby, that you hear of?
Well, I like thinking about that formal and informal aspect of it, because I think bringing both, I feel like I've learned from people that, yes, maybe something that happens on a birthday that's a little bit more formal and structured. We have this food, we do this thing, and also, just touching a picture every day when you pass it in the hallway. These little things are rituals too.
Yeah, thank you. Great point. Yeah, I know people who will like have a brief conversation with the person, like kind of touch the urn or something, and talk to them. This can be certainly, this is pointing back to finding ways to honor your loved one. And again, there's so many ways that are outside of rituals as well to honor your loved one. Some people find that the way they live their life is honoring to the person. Sometimes I'll talk to people and they're like, I'm not actively grieving, and I'll say, what does that mean? Let's talk about that. And what I'm really hearing underneath that is, I want to actively grieve because then it feels like it's honoring of this loss. It's honoring of the person. And so there's just so many ways to honor. This, again, it might be where you have a little bit of agency in your grieving process to think about, like, what does feel honoring? How do I want to do this? It can feel honoring to talk about the person, to kind of say, I'm going to bring this person up and tell stories and whatnot. So again, it's just an invitation to explore what might feel helpful for you.
This is the seventh strategy here, which is exploring how this event, this loss, is redefining you. My life was suddenly divided into before and after, and there was no going back to before. But then I realized I had a choice how to live the after. I had to decide. I want to acknowledge that this is something that is worth thinking about, and it might be not now. It could be a little further down the road, that you can even stop to take a breath to think about this kind of thing. You are forever changed by the loss you've had, and it may not be apparent how. And I think I also just want to acknowledge that, this is you're different and you're changed by something you didn't want to happen probably. And so that takes some time to even get your head around what has happened, let alone how it's changing you. So inevitably, you will be changed. Has this loss affected your identity? Um, Certainly I talk to people who have spent decades identifying as we, and so that's a big change. That's a big adjustment. Your social circle. I like how Megan Devine says that grief will rearrange your address book. There's some truth to that. Usually there's some change there. Your family system. I think a family is a system, and there's all these gears turning, and it doesn't keep working the same way when an important part is removed. So the whole family can often rearrange and just be different in how you relate to each other. What about your ideas about the future? Your sense of normalcy and what can and can't happen in life can be all shaken up. Um, Anything you would like to add to that, Jamie?
No, but I'm gonna steal the gears analogy. Yeah. I always like the way I describe that too is that I think about, like when someone enters a family system by marriage or by birth, the whole system has to adjust to that. And then
Mhm.
the same thing happens when someone leaves by divorce or death or whatnot. The whole system, like Libby said, has to adjust and function differently. And it also, we work with a lot of families that's a very challenging adjustment. There can be a lot of tension and whatnot. And that's also understandable and normal if that's what you're experiencing.
Thanks for that. This is just the end of our presentation, and just going to pause here to reflect on other resources. This is not an exhaustive list. If sometimes this is the first thing people find with our grief and bereavement program, this presentation. If so, feel free to reach out and ask about our other offerings, which include support groups and classes. We have some children's services. Other health systems have sometimes, well, often similar things, grief support groups and counseling and things like that. There's lots of stuff, as Jamie mentioned before, online these days, and there's groups and communities and all kinds of different levels of engagement with that. Sometimes faith communities have great grief support, or senior centers, community centers, things like that. If you're helping a child, there's resources through school. Anything you'd like to add, Jamie?
Yeah, the only thing I was thinking of is that I just wanted to normalize that given that we've talked about it being such a journey and a process, that you might find that your needs really change over time. That what your needs are look like now might look very different in 6 months. And so just to know that we are a resource to help you get connected to the resources or services that might feel more supportive down the road. Sometimes people need to come up for air, first to engage things, and that's really okay. So even if it's down the road, feel free to utilize us. I guess it should be somewhere in your in these it's kind of all over the packet, but you are welcome to call our bereavement community line, which is 503-215-4622. And that's accessible to anyone in the community. So you can pass that on to other people in your life if that feels helpful. But we check that. So.
Yes, thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for joining us. And like we said, feel free to reach out if there's something you'd like to touch base about or find out about what else we offer or help finding other resources. Yeah. Take care.
Take care.